All right, welcome to all of you, and thank you for making the time to attend this webinar today. My name is Lorenzo Ferri, and I'm a product director at Elsevier, working in RDM for a little over 4 years. I have to say that I've seen an acceleration in the interest for RDM in the last 18 to 24 months, and it's in response to this big interest that we decided to organize this webinar. Now, let me add, actually, I think that we have passed a tipping point that demarcates the difference between seeing RDM as something for the future, just a vision, to understanding that RDM is something here and now, and that we have to roll up the sleeves to make it happen. In the past 4 years, I've been talking to many institutions, many practitioners, many of you. And I know that many of you increasingly have questions on where do I start? What do I have to do to set up an RDM program at my institution? So in order to answer these questions, we decided to organize this webinar and bring together a set of experts and practitioners from the fields who will share their experience with you. Hopefully, you will be able to leave this webinar with some additional knowledge on how to put RDM into practice in your institution and what are the best practices. Before I introduce the panelists, let me add that there will be a panel discussion at the end of this webinar, but do feel free to share your questions in the Q&A if you have questions throughout the webinar, and we'll try to address them either throughout the webinar or at the end. All right, so the speakers we have today are Paul Vierkant, the outreach manager from DataCite. We have Nienke de Groot, research data management specialist at the Erasmus University, and Dr. Julian de Derke, a consultant for research data management at the ETH in Zurich. I will hand over the baton and the floor to our speakers in a moment, but I would like to take 2 more minutes to share my perspective on where I think we are with RDM and what is pushing RDM to action. As I said, I think we have passed the tipping points that demarcates the difference between seeing RDM as a future vision versus understanding that RDM, research data management, is something here and now, and it's a high priority that we have to act upon. And I believe that there are 3 main forces that have contributed to accelerate this and to make this a higher priority in the last time. And these are funders, publishers, and governments. Funders with their policies to ensure that researchers share their data, make it openly available as part of their research projects. Publishers like Elsevier, but also other publishers who are codifying into policies the desire to see authors share their data together with the publications. And then governments understanding that research data management and open data is a national interest, it's a strategic priority, and are now codifying in national strategic agendas the importance of sharing data. And I'm really glad to say that I observe this as being a global phenomenon with no major differences between different parts of the world. As I said, I've been interacting with many of you, with many of your colleagues at institutions, and I've been learning a lot about what you and your colleagues are doing to put RDM into practice already. So here is my learning so far about some of the initiatives that you and some of your colleagues at other institutions are putting into place to make RDM a reality at your institution. I see that there's an interest in hiring data specialists, be it data stewards or data librarians, that can support researchers at your institution to practice RDM. I see that some institutions are providing supports to researchers on how to write good data management plans. I see some institutions deciding to acquire a data repository or anyway, finding ways to support your researchers into data sharing and data storage. I see an increasing interest in trying to track the research data produced by your institution, by your researchers, In order to be able to understand what's going on in your institution when it comes to RDM, in order to reports against institutional policies or national policies, but also to assess generally how we are doing as an institution when it comes to RDM. And I see many institutions having an interest in showcasing their open data, their research data in their public portals alongside publications to show that they're part of it, to show that RDM actually matters. Now, I can imagine that all of these may be overwhelming, particularly if your institution is starting with RDM only now. And actually, what we want to do in this webinar is trying to address exactly this question: where do we start? What are the best practices? What are do's and don'ts? And for that, I will actually hand over to our speakers, starting with Paul Vierkant from DataCite, who will be able to share his point of view from DataCite. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Lorenzo. And yeah, also thank you, Alexandra, for inviting me to give this talk here. Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Vierkant. I'm DataCite's outreach manager. I've been with DataCite for 3 years now, and I'm responsible for outreach and communication. And also, obviously, for one of the core topics that we deal with at DataCite with metadata or data infrastructure. And the question, as Lorenzo already had pointed out, is often like, who does the work? Like, everyone wants to have work with data or needs to work with data, research data, and but actually somebody has to do the work or the job in the end. And this is what my talk will be about today. I will give you a short intro to DataCite and what we're doing. Then some words about metadata and how important it is, and even how important standards in this context are, and how the community can contribute to the goal of creating a great home for your data. So this is just to illustrate what kind of organization DataCite is. We are a non-profit organization, a global one, that constitutes of more than 280 members with more than 2,700 repositories and about 40 million DOIs minted until today. So it's a quite global community that DataCite consists of. And what we do actually, and what this visual on the left is supposed to show, is that with persistent identifiers, research outputs produced at a university or research institution will give you the opportunity as an institution to connect your research outputs, like data to publications, to software, to samples. And then this, in the second step, enables researchers to discover those research outputs. And based on that, again, it will be way easier to track, if not, like, it's actually possible. Without persistent identifiers, tracking of research is like really impossible to do. And that's why it is easier to track with PIDs such as DOIs to track your research output on a national or global scale. So this kind of circle comes back, and those are the benefits that you as an organization have using PIDs such as a DOI from DataCite. And it's not only about using just the PID, but it's more about metadata. And although it might be a quite dry topic, it's really important because you gotta have information about the research data that you're having, because like people in the future, they will ask questions about that and will wonder what this data is about. And you need as much contextual information as possible. And that's why we have a quite comprehensive metadata schema. And this is now in the version 4.4. So it's been around for more than a decade right now. And it was developed through several versions. And as you can see, we have only a few mandatory fields and other recommended and optional ones. But also, in addition, we have, as I mentioned, resource types that are described, not only the ones that I mentioned referring to the visual, but more like modern ones like output management plans, software, interactive resources, but also with the new version 4.4, we have more textual ones like dissertation, journal article, and so forth. So there's a variety of resource types that can be described using our schema. And this enables institutions and researchers to describe their research outputs and really do research data management. And from this, again, theoretical framework of the metadata schema, you can then get to what you can see on the left, making connections. And this is also, again, just to show you the possibilities of connecting the different entities within scholarly communication. So you have a publication, for instance, that is based on a data set, and also there was software used to create this publication. And this publication references another publication or cites it, and then this publication has an author. In this case, obviously, it would have an ORCID ID as a persistent identifier for researchers and contributors. And this author is linked to the institution because of the funding that they received from that institution. And the other authors of this publication are linked via their affiliation to that very institution. So you can see all the relations and links between the entities that we have are important in order to make to create this contextual information, so that you can, as a researcher, find out more about the publication and the context of the publication and data set, but also about the people behind it and the institutions. And to show you that this is not just a theoretical thing, you can see on the right, there is the PIT graph, which visualizes this graphic on the right visualizes the PIT graph, where that is basically a database of the metadata belonging to open persistent identifiers like DOIs from DataCite and Crossref, but also persistent identifiers for organizations like the Research Organization Registry ID for organizations, obviously, but also the ORCID ID that I just mentioned. And you can see all those relations and items that are in there and how they are connected. And this is how the to show you the importance of metadata as such. And since Lorenzo has already mentioned it on his first slide, it's not something that we ourselves came up with, but rather there are policy funders that ask for it and within their mandates to make research fair. And as you can see, and this is just to show you that over the course of the last decade, within our schema, we directed or we shifted towards making fair research possible through the description of the research using different fields, as you can see here, like affiliation identifier, rights identifier, and so forth. So using our metadata schema is crucial for making your research data fair. And as I said, using standards is crucial, and it's great to use them right from the start and not only at the beginning, at the end of the whole process. And therefore, persistent identifiers represent standards in that field, and they foster interoperability because, as I've shown, these connections would not be possible if there are identifiers that only work on a local or national scale, but they need to be globally interoperable. And the community is the question is who is generating these or creating this metadata or even curating it by updating it. And we in the course of some of our events that we had at DataCite, we were asking the question to our attendees as well, the question of who's responsible for creating or enriching or making metadata complete, which is one of our crucial topics, as is at the core of what we do at DataCite, providing metadata and DOIs we asked the question, who's responsible? And they were all pointing fingers at each other, like data curators, researchers, and librarians. But in the end, it turned out that we also asked the question, who is actually enriching metadata? So who is doing the job currently? And it was that the data curators and librarians. But coming back to the question, like, what was the goal again? And as the title of this webinar is to make create a great home for your research data. It is to make these research outputs discoverable and usable in the future. So, as I said, it cannot be one stakeholder alone, like DataCite, or even publishers or funders, but it takes all of us. So it's actually the community that should do the job. And here I'm borrowing a visual from the Center of Open Science. This pyramid illustrates how we can, or how we could do that. This is one approach that that we could take. And actually, I wanted to go through these different steps with you. So it's open infrastructures. As I mentioned, DataCite is a non-profit global open infrastructure providing DOIs to organizations worldwide. And doing so, we wanna enable these organizations to bring services such as DOI to their researchers. And we do that together with other non-profit organizations signing the principles of open scholarly infrastructure, POSI, just like Crossref, ROR, and ORCID. So it's us as infrastructures to make it possible, like on a basic level. The next thing would be that at research institutions or universities, they should set up interfaces with repositories or journals, journal hosting, for instance, but also the publishers. They should provide easy interfaces on these platforms in order to make it easy for researchers, so that it's not a burden that they create the metadata for their research data, and that research data management does not become like a main focus for their work, because whatever they are supposed to do is do research and not so much administrating it. Then coming back to the communities, we should make it normative. That means like it should be the norm to do research data management, to take care of research data, but also on a high level that everyone in the future and currently can work with the research data provided using the metadata that there is. And so, as you can see, we have within the community of DataCite, we see collaborators such as Crossref and ORCID, but also our members who provide repositories directly to the researchers. But there are also policymakers, as Lorenzo said, that through these policies mandate things on researchers. But also we do have integrators such as BASE, for instance, the Bielefeld Academic Search Engine, and other service providers who integrate with our services. And then make it rewarding. We should, from my perspective, reframe the topic of as I said, the dry topic of metadata, to have it more to show more what's in for the researchers, because if they don't see what's in for them, it's really difficult to transport this idea of the importance of metadata. So rather put a focus on the academic search engine optimization, so that tell the researchers that there is higher visibility for their research, and possibly resulting in higher impact for their research. In addition, also the research organizations should have more incentives by telling them, okay, metadata is really crucial for your visibility of your institutional research output. And also what we had, again, Lorenzo said it already, that funders make it required. So it's not only bottom up from the open infrastructures, but also from top down, from the funders, who should make things required by asking for research data management plans and so forth. And that would be my takeaway message for all of us, that it's not possible for one stakeholder group to do this job alone, but rather to work together with the other stakeholders to build this great home together in order to make this a reality. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much for your contribution. And I want to say also thank you for the work that DataCite is doing, because I think DataCite is doing an incredible job to support the community, support all practitioners to provide the tools to make RDM happen. I must say I was particularly struck by this message, and you have it also here on the screen now. Let's build this great home together. I think that's one of my key takeaways from your presentation. Putting RDM into practice will be a collaborative effort. So we all need to play our role to make sure that we can actually make it happen. You also pointed out the incredible importance that institutions and the libraries have. I like the animation with the Spider-Man. So a good reminder to think how important of a role the library can play in an institution to bring RDM to life. And one more thing that's is very dear to me, and you shared, is about the importance of quality metadata. Quality metadata is key, and the importance of persistent identifiers. And we need to make a collective effort to educate the community, to educate the researchers, but also to help the researchers to increase the quality of the metadata, because that will be of great importance to advance the reuse of data and RDM in general. So thank you so much, Paul. I hope you can come online then for the panel in the end. I will now pass the baton on to Nienke. Nienke, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thanks, Lorenzo, for giving me the floor. So hi, everybody. My name is Nienke de Groot, and I am the Research Data Management Specialist from the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Oh, the last slide of my predecessor. There you go. And I'm very honored to be here today, and it's quite a pleasure, but it's also quite it made me think, because I was asked to present something short and simple about data preservation, archiving, and publishing. But I can tell you from experience, there's nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing simple about this topic. And if you want to discuss all details that come with archiving, publishing, and preserving, well, I would not call that short. So it took me quite some time to think of a way of how I wanted to tackle this. And my first thoughts in this was that I did not want to go into content very much, because the decision about, for example, if you want to have a data repository, and if so, how you want to manage that, depends very much on your own institution. So I decided to take more a project management approach. So here's my take on creating a great home for your data. Oh, something is off. There we go. What I usually do when I talk to my researchers, I show them this slide, just to outline how the research data lifecycle phases. So obviously a researcher prepares, collects, and stores and analyzes data. And when they're done with that, they want to publish part of that data and part of their publications as well. And they want to archive something. And with publishing, we generally mean to publish something in a data repository, or other repository where it can be found and reused. And when we talk about archiving, we talk about closed storage archiving for documents that you really do want to preserve. So for example, your informed consents and all those other types of important documentation, but that you don't generally share in the repository. So hence, this is a distinction that we made. And now I'm cutting it a little bit short, but in my take is that doing everything that you do to prepare your data for publishing or archiving is what we call data preservation, also called data curation or verification or data preparation. Now, I do know these concepts overlap a bit, but they are different. But for the sake of this presentation, I will just group them all into one. And the last thing I added here, someone is taking over my presentation, or there's a poltergeist, that is also a possibility. But and the last thing that I wanted to show here and is the little X and Y axis that I put in, is that when you want to start preserving or actually taking actions to preserve data or archive or publish it, you actually want to start thinking about that before you even start designing your research project. So everything that you do for preservation and publishing and archiving starts at the beginning of a research project and continues throughout the entire cycle. So it would be easy if we could do everything for preservation at one point in time, but that's just not in practice how it works. And another one here is on the y-axis is the disciplines within your organization, because you need, well, at least at our university, and we have a lot of different specialists, but those specialists are usually a part of different departments. So it becomes a very multidisciplinary and cross-departmental effort to establish a great home for publishing, archiving, and preserving. So that kind of sets the stage, and I hope that does show that it's really a complex thing. But I don't want to discourage everyone, so please bear with me for a second. Now, I have a research background. So when I was looking through some interesting journal databases, I found a paper about determinants of innovation success. And that made me very happy because that provided me with the perfect, in Dutch we say kapstok, the perfect outline or setup for this presentation. So generally what these authors did, they grouped characteristics into 4 areas. So characteristics of the socio-political context, characteristics of the organization, characteristics of the innovation, and those of the adopting person. So these are the 4 main areas. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give a few examples of what they mean with each of these areas and share some of my personal experiences with them. But basically, where I wanted to start is just with summarizing what was just said. In my personal view, I think you can summarize it as follows. You have an innovation that of an organization implements an innovation in an effort to facilitate its users, and users can use innovation to connect to the organization. And I think that really summarizes that those two have to fit really well. And I guess that's part of what makes it very complex to realize. All right, so moving on. First, the characteristics of the socio-political context. Basically, what the authors say, it's about all relevant policies apply, and that could be national policies, international policies, university policies, faculty policies. Yeah, so basically, the innovation that you want to implement has to be in line with all of these different policies, and that is a challenge, but that is what it is. Number 2, the characteristics of the organization. So of course, the organization has to be ready to implement a new innovation. So management has to be behind it. You need to have enough people to work on it, and you need to have backup. So for example, if someone drops out, and it's all, for example, sufficient resources, time, money, materials, equipment, space, etc. And you have to be aware of any other innovations that might be going on at the same time. And these are all pretty, well, self-explanatory, and they all seem to make sense. But still, I found it very enlightening to actually read that it's officially published that these are actually the things that are really important when implementing a new innovation. Number 3 is the characteristics of the innovation itself. Also makes kind of sense. It has to be clear what you have to do. It has to be complete. It has to be correct. It has to work. Actually, it has to fit with the current way of working. And it actually has to be very relevant and visible for the outcomes of your user. And number 4, the characteristics of the adopting person. Of course, you can summarize that as what's in it for me. If it doesn't work, people won't use it. So it has to be something that fits with what they need and what works, perceived benefit, etc. And so you can actually see if it will be, what the uptake will be. So that's a bit about the theory. So I will switch to my personal experience in this sense. So I would like to emphasize these are my personal experiences, so they do not necessarily reflect the position of the university. So you have to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt. But first, the characteristics of the socio-political context. In my experience, I think it's a matter of learning to live with international or national and institutional policy, because they're usually pretty complex and they take several years to develop. So from our perspective, what we try to do as much as possible is to create a best practice bottom up and show that it actually works. And based on that, policy will follow. Now, obviously, I have to say things like GDPR, privacy law, that's something you can work on bottom up. That's just the fact that you have to take into account. But generally speaking, it's about what works best in practice. And the second one here is to be aware of how your position and perhaps absence of policy implements or affects your results. So, for example, I am based at the library and our faculties are very independent. So I do not have the mandate to go to a faculty director and say, we want you to use this tool or this piece of software or implement this service. Because our faculties, they prefer to have things their own way. So that might mean that the envisioned goals you had or the results that you would love to see, they either take more time to come into effect, or they might not come into effect at all. So you have to take that into account. Second, moving to the characteristics of the organization. The one thing that I always noticed is that the one thing that I wanted to do is gather a multidisciplinary team from the onset. It's best to get your building blocks straight from the beginning, because if they are not straight, you cannot build your tower. So this is, I think, in my perspective, one of the most important experiences. Gather a multidisciplinary team in which you represent every department or every expert that you need, and create a shared vision first and a strategy that combines both your organizational and your user needs. And that might be a bit of a lengthy sentence, but what I mean is with vision is that you want to think about how do we want to profile our university? How do we want our researchers to be profiled, or how can they profile themselves? What type of software do we need? What type of functionality do we need? And what type of people we have so they can use them properly? And most especially, maybe that also is in line with what Paul said before this presentation, is think about the metadata, because that is how software communicates with one another. So for example, we have our institutional data repository, and we asked our researchers to add the DOI that it generates to our research information system, because in the future we would like to have that as an automated process, again, which is all comes down to how software communicates. So think about this before you actually start determining what type of tools or software you would need. Now, the second one here, be very clear about the scope and set the definitions for the term used. And with scope, I mean, sorry, apologies. With definitions, I literally mean what is archiving or what is a backup, for example, because that might seem very straightforward. But we had a really interesting discussion with our IT department about what is a backup. So from our perspective, from the data repository and data archive perspective, we want to preserve a copy of the original files that were put in our archives, and maybe also different versions when some alterations are made. And it doesn't matter if that original version was put in yesterday or last year or 20 years ago. We want to have certain fixed important files that we want to have backed up for all time. So that is our take on it. But then when we went to our IT department, they had a very interesting vision of their own. And they said, we can give you they said, everything is backed up for 5 days ago. So if your computer crashes today, we can give you a backup of yesterday or of 5 days ago, and that's it. So bye-bye first version or different versions. Yeah, and that creates some challenges or some complications maybe. So hence be very clear about what exactly it is that you mean with even these most obvious seeming terms. So be clear about that. And I think I already touched upon this a little bit, but sketch out your ecosystem, and that includes all the tools and services and roles and tasks and responsibilities that you need. Our management would very much like to have one tool that does it all, but it just doesn't work that way. And you usually need several tools that collaborate together. And a little personal touch here is to present the same information in various ways. So our library director, he used to be very text oriented, whereas someone like me, I am very visual oriented. So in a discussion that we had about how we saw our strategy, it was sometimes difficult to get on the same page simply because we have different ways of thinking about the same things. So make sure you have that very clear from the onset. And now I'll go to the next slide. Yep. So some more experiences from my perspective, relating to the characteristics of the innovation. I have seen way too many times that when a piece of software or a service or whatever, if it is not user-friendly, your adopting person will not adopt it, no matter how perfect your tool is. So make sure that your users are part of if you can, make sure that they are part of your implementation process or the project, get feedback so you can make sure that it is exactly that it meets their expectations, so they will actually start using it. And the last one here, characteristics of the adopting person. Again, researchers incredibly enthusiastic about doing research, not very enthusiastic about doing administration. So we learned from that perspective to always provide hands-on support, even for the most simple steps, no matter how small or simple. Provide hands-on support, have information materials about all these types of things, very specific. So for example, one thing that we used to do is have a presentation about introduction to our repository. But we found that very few researchers would attend this because it was too vague for them. So when we switched that to shorter formats and very specific formats, so for example, how do I connect my ORCID account with our institutional archive? That is very much more concrete for them, and that would actually draw people in because they want to know about that specific topic. And the second one here, I skipped that because I skipped that for now. But when in conversation with your researchers or whatever stakeholders you have, always use LSD, which means in this case, listen, summarize, and dig deeper. So because often people talk about A, but they mean B. And again, that's in with what I said previously about making sure your definitions and terms are the same. Because if you don't check these types of things, people will start having expectations. And then when a project is realized or finished, those expectations might not be met. And that's just sad. So yeah, you definitely use LSD. All right, and I think this is one of my last two slides. So even more experiences of a veteran. Well, these ones, of course, are not based on the 4 areas that were outlined in the research paper that I was talking about, but these are personal experiences. Number 5, I listed as make it everybody's problem, because key persons need to feel responsible for the outcome. So what we did, we went to the heads of our faculties and we asked them if we could perform a rollout of our repository at their faculty. And they said, yes, of course you can, have fun and do your thing, which is really great. But actually what you want to achieve is that this head of a faculty or whatever other important colleague feels responsible for actually, in this case, uptake of using the repository. Because they are in a position to point to people and say, I want you to do this, you're responsible for that, you need to work with these people. And that actually gives people the little push that they need to actually start working on this innovation. Because we do understand that people are generally very busy and they don't generally have time to start doing implementation projects as well. And also make very prominent users advocates for innovation. So at our university, we have open science champions who are very yep, I'm almost finished. So we have open science champions who advocate open science among their peers. And we actually see that they are very good in reaching their colleagues and trying to and help them use, for example, the repository or work with open science. I will be a bit quicker about 6 and 7. So number 6, reach out to other organizations for help and look into the mirror, because every organization has the same struggles. So don't feel you're the odd one out, because everyone struggles with the same. So do contact others, because, well, together you know more than alone. And last but not least, please do touch that with a 10-foot pole. And with that, I mean, there are always so many issues, and some issues have been going on for a long time, and people love to try to go around these issues. But no matter how big or small or on what level or how long they've been around, please do address them, because they have to be solved if you want to be successful at your implementation. And like I said in the beginning, if your building blocks are not aligned, you can't build them up. So this is then my last slide. In conclusion, think twice or maybe even thrice before you innovate. A good beginning is the job half done. And please always remember that we all struggle with the same issues. But if you then do it correctly, put some time in your project management, and you can build a great house, as you see on the right, in this case made of Kapla, for, in this case, your research data. So thank you for your attention.
And thank you so much, Tinke, for your contribution. I think you reminded us that research data management at an institution should be approached as a project. I heard other institutions saying as a change management project, where you define clear goals, and I think also in your last slide, clear and simple goals that are easy to achieve, and then builds on that. And also, you're not alone. There are resources, there are other practitioners, so do reach out, because we don't want to reinvent the wheel. Thank you so much. Over to Julian. Julian, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Lorenzo, for the kind introduction, and thanks for the input from Paul and Nienke. My name is Julian de Derke. I'm working as a consultant for research data management at the ETH Zurich Library, and I would like to focus today on an institutional perspective from ETH Zurich. And I think I could very much echo what Nienke said and provided from her perspective, that it's worth looking towards other institutions and learning from one another. And the slides are having their own life, so I need to switch back here. I'm happy to provide this second perspective from ETH Zurich on the topic of data publishing, archiving, and preserving. All the three are, of course, really important elements of research data management. And this is also why I would like to start off with summarizing how we look at the potential of managing research data. I think managing research data is really a crucial precondition if we talk about data publishing, preserving, and archiving, because if we talk about data publishing, it also concerns open research data, of course. And an important point here is that only with proper research data management, of course, we are able to basically distinguish categories of data and decide which are the relevant data that we need to actually publish, archive, or preserve. One of the potentials of managing research data properly is embracing good practice principles. And I would like to emphasize here that embracing good practice principles doesn't always mean reaching out to your support professional or perhaps watching an Elsevier seminar series or webinar series on research data management. Sometimes it also means looking for the right solutions on the ground in the research groups themselves. From our experience in a lot of at our institution, there's often certain research groups who are already at the forefront of embracing good practice principles in research data management, and research groups can also learn from one another. Second, one of the potentials of research data management, and I think that is really important because I also read about the question of incentives in the chat, is that with proper research data management, we can enable researchers to also get acknowledgement for fair research output. The third point I wanted to make here is that ideally, good practice in research data management can also build on existing community standards that might be within your own institution or perhaps in a certain research field that has established standards already. And sometimes, and that is our experience at ETH Zurich, in some research groups, there are already long established processes that are already in place, and we need to kind of lift this potential, but we also need to find out first about where this knowledge is located for proper research data management in one or the other research field. Finally, Lorenzo mentioned right in the beginning that this drive towards research data management being a very big topic and we all engaging with it comes from funder requirements and also from strategies, from government strategies. And then, of course, when translating those funder requirement and government strategies, each and every research institutions plays an important role. And in our case, and what I wanted to bring in today is that guidelines from the institutions can be a very important instrument here. And luckily, we managed also after a long discussion and decision-making process, like it's usual in any research institution, I guess, we managed to establish research data management guidelines in 2022. And these are really supposed to support ETH Zurich researchers with filling gaps in achieving best practices. So guidelines are not only the requirements that one has to abide to, but they are also supposed to enable researchers. And this is the second point I wanted to dig into. What are the major RDM requirements at ETH Zurich? And of course, this is a lengthy text document as we used to know it from legal texts, but I tried to fit the major points on one slide here and wanted to give you an overview about this. So the first one is that ETH researchers should include research data management in the planning of their activities, meaning that RDM is a standard part of conducting scientific research. Second, a DMP is expected for every research project at ETH Zurich with clear temporal boundaries, and that is, of course, most research projects. Third, research data must be published in a fair repository, generally at the time of publication of results. That's what funders expect as well, but we actually also have translated it now in the institutional guidelines. Fourth, all publications of research results must contain a data availability statement. And that also means if I talk to, I don't know, medical researchers or social science researchers who say, I cannot publish my data because they are strictly confidential, they are sensitive, it means I can write a data availability statement reading, I cannot share the data because of, but it still needs to include a data availability statement. Point number 5, research data must be retained generally for at least 10 years. That is the minimum storage period that we also often know from data that is published, but this basically applies not only to the published data, but also to other data that should be kept at the institution. And the final point I wanted to mention is that project members, and this is important for planning, of course, project members shall determine as early as possible how data is shared externally and how data may be used by persons leaving the project team. That is a really important point also to enable researchers who move on from one institution to another to actually continue working with their precious research data, even if they haven't exploited them fully or published them yet. So much about the major requirements in the guidelines that have been adopted at ETH Zurich last year. What were or are the principles underlying these RDM guidelines? One point I mentioned already is that these guidelines define and support research data management activities as a scientific activities. So it's not something that is plucked on top of our research, but it's really seen as an integral part of doing research and doing scientific work. And that is, I would say, consistent with ETH, but also national and international initiatives. Second, data publishing, archiving, and preserving are, of course, integral parts of research data management. Third, those guidelines also acknowledge that recognized standards and best practices in different research communities, whether they are at one institution or spanning across several institutions or even globally, they are an important reference point. And this also meant that for us, the research data management guidelines actually also make an explicit link between research data management and scientific integrity. So it is considered as an integral part of scientific work, and it's also connected to scientific integrity. The guidelines also specify some vocabulary and principles, meaning that they define what actually research data management is from the perspective of ETH Zurich, or for example, what we mean with community standards. And those guidelines also determine responsibilities within the institution. For example, they read that us as the ETH library and scientific IT services are responsible for providing support for research data management. So these are the underlying principles. So what I wanted to emphasize one of them. One is that the role of community standards is quite key. Like in many research institutions, I guess, ETH Zurich is a large technical university, and there's a diversity of disciplines ranging from engineering, medical sciences, but also architecture and social and political sciences. And that, of course, comes with the potential and challenge that the data that are generated are very heterogeneous. And it also means that there are heterogeneous community practices. So usually there is no one-size-fits-all solution, and that is something that ideally can be acknowledged in such a complex institution and research environment. And that is why community standards are a relevant anchor of the RDM guidelines that we have adopted at ETH Zurich. If we read, for example, the definition of what research data are, they are defined as all data that are all data that the relevant scientific community accepts as necessary for validating research findings. And then, of course, we could also look at what we actually understand as community standards. And this is admittedly a rather lengthy definition. They are understood as both explicit, formalized standards and informal, but well-established and widely accepted best practices within a community. And they somehow reflect a community's consensus at a certain point in time on how reproducible and reusable research data should be implemented. And I think this is something really important because there are so many different disciplines that we cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach here. For example, there are disciplines where the standard is that one shares a simulation model instead of the terabytes of data that are created in computer simulations. So in some cases, it's not reasonable to share terabytes of created data if I can recreate the data from a shared computational model. That's just one of the few examples. So community standards are key. The illustration occurred a bit later. So since data publication is one of the key aspects of the focus of today's topic, data publication is, of course, also among the requirements that I mentioned. And this actually, in case of ETH Zurich, also not only includes research data, but also programming code that is central when we talk about data publication. Both are considered, and those that are considered as directly relevant for a result publication based on community standards must be published and deposited in a fair repository according to our guidelines. But of course, the relevant data can also be a subset of the collected data or could be aggregated data as we are used to. And then, of course, there can still be legal or ethical restrictions that might apply. I think in the chat, someone already mentioned, what about sensitive data? For example, person-related data. And what is also mentioned in our guidelines is that commercial repositories should be avoided. So much about the requirements on data publishing. but what about the solutions, of course, you might ask. I'm very much aware that it's not possible and not implemented at every institution that there is an institutional repository available. But from our perspective, actually, when we provide advice and consulting for researchers, we actually often say that discipline-specific repositories provide a lot of advantages because they might provide discipline-specific metadata schemes. And then we are back at Paul's input in the beginning. Often discipline-specific repositories are actually a better solution because they can address certain community standards better than a general institutional repository that is basically a catch-all repository. Nevertheless, at ETH Zurich, we are very glad that we have our institutional repository, the ETH Research Collection, which is a catch-all repository for any discipline. And a key advantage, of course, of having this is that the data at ETH Zurich are at the same location at the bibliography and also published articles in their open access version. So this is, of course, something very precious, but I also understand it's not available in every institution. In our case, we actually also have an integrated solution for the repository and the digital archive, which means that the ETH Research Collection as the repository does not only include the university bibliography and function as a research data repository, but any document or dataset that is submitted to this institutional repository is actually also fed into the ETH data archive that offers long-term preservation, copy of all documents and datasets from the research collection, and it's a large data archive that allows data to be kept in the long run. And it's certainly no easy task to explain the archiving process that takes place. And I'm super glad that I have my colleagues who are the experts and data archivists in my team. But I wanted to just provide this, a bit simplified illustration, of course, of what is actually going on if we think about data archiving and preservation, what happens at ETH Zurich for preserving data in the long run. So it's basically, you could say in the beginning, a health check of the files and datasets that are submitted. And the long-term archiving system Rosetta is used in case of ETH Zurich, that is offered by Ex Libris. And there are basically several access workflows to get one's data into the data archive. And the standard is the submission via the institutional repositories. There will always be a checksum verification and a virus check. The file formats will be identified. Metadata are extracted from the submitted files or the folder packages. And the format is being validated to check whether all the format specifications are actually available, so we can make sure it's readable in the long run. And all this information is, of course, saved in the case of so in case the file format basically goes extinct, they have to be transformed. And now the key takeaways. I should switch the slide. I mentioned formal requirements, but they are only one side of the coin, certainly. Incentives are really important, and also a continuous cultural change. We need to take researchers on the boat to achieve good practice principles and achieve proper data publishing, archiving, and preservation. It takes institutional commitment, but we also need to meet researchers where they are and embrace their community standards. We need to enable research communities, whether in our institution or overlapping research institutions. And ideally, we can also provide infrastructure and support from the side of one institution, or actually for several institutions. Yeah, and with that, I will hand over to Lorenzo, I guess.
Thank you so much, Julian. Thank you. And thank you to all the audience. As you can see, unfortunately, we do not have time for the panel discussion today. However, let me remind you that in a week from now, there will be webinar number 2. So I invite you to join that one as well, and we'll make sure to have a panel discussion then. Let me also mention that the slides and the recording will be shared. And of course, feel free to reach out to me or one of the audience if you want to follow up with something specific. With that, thank you so much for joining today. We hope you enjoyed. Give us feedback on how we can improve this even further next time. Until next time, have a good day. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.